Alright, this story is insane and could tell us a lot about Donald Trump's plans if he wins a second term. The New York Times dropped this bombshell a few months back about the ways that Donald Trump abused his clemency while leaving office in ways that he could abuse it heading into his second term, but this article really flew under the radar despite there being some really disturbing stuff. The headline reads, "A troubling pardon and a link to the Kushners. A commutation for a drug smuggler named Jonathan Braun had broader implications than previously known. It puts new focus on how Donald Trump would use his clemency powers in a second term." And I want to break down the entire timeline in a simple way before I go through this article. Jonathan Braun was sentenced to prison for 1 decade for running a large marijuana smuggling ring. That is Jonathan Braun with the yellow arrow above his head right here. He had a history of violent threats that we will read about, but the big part is his history of predatory lending practices. So on his last day in office, Donald Trump pardons Jonathan Braun after he'd only served 2.5 years of his 10-year sentence, and Braun's family reportedly lobbied for this by spending millions of dollars for his release. But this is the crazy part. Immediately after Braun gets out, he returns to his predatory lending schemes. On top of that, the commutation was perfectly placed to disrupt an actively ongoing criminal investigation by the DOJ into that same predatory lending industry. After his release, Braun immediately continued to engage in fraudulent and violent practices, immediately leading to bans and lawsuits. Meanwhile, the DOJ's case essentially fell apart. Jared Kushner's office and family played a massive role in drafting the commutation announcement, and Donald Trump was listening to lawyers like Alan Dershowitz. So I'm going to break down how this could affect Donald Trump's second term and how it could relate to the January 6th so-called hostages. First, make sure you leave a like on this video if you appreciate what I do. Let's break down part of this article, then we even have a video explaining this in simple terms. Even amid the uproar over President Donald J. Trump's freewheeling use of his pardon powers at the end of his term, one commutation stood out. Jonathan Braun of New York had just served 2.5 years for running a massive marijuana ring. A Staten Islander with a history of violent threats, Mr. Braun had told a rabbi who owed him money, quote, "I'm going to make you bleed." Mr. Braun's family had told confidants they were willing to spend millions of dollars to get him out of prison. Remember, they lobbied to get him out. At the time, Mr. Trump's own DOJ and federal regulators were still after him for his role in an entirely separate matter. This is the important part right here. Braun's work as a predatory lender, making what judges later found were fraudulent and usurious loans to cash-strapped small businesses. And there's a repeated pattern of Donald Trump not only committing crimes himself, but aiding other people's crimes and covering them up for them. I mean, does it not make Trump supporters think when every single person that worked around Trump in his cabinet, well, not every single one, let's say about 60% of them, ended up serving prison time and needed to be pardoned by Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump pardoned so many people over his last few days that he kind of hoped this one would slip under the radar, and it did. This New York Times report, this bombshell report, didn't drop for 2 years after the pardoning actually happened. Nearly 3 years later, the consequences of Mr. Braun's, 3 years after, nearly 3 years later, the consequences of Mr. Braun's commutation are becoming clear, raising new questions about how Mr. Trump intervened in a criminal justice decision and what he could do in a second term when he would have the power to make good on his suggestions that he would free supporters convicted of storming the Capitol. Just months after Mr. Trump freedom, Mr. Braun returned to working as a predatory lender. What did Donald Trump get out of this is the question. So just to summarize a little bit more, the commutation dealt a substantial blow to an ambitious criminal investigation being led by the DOJ. Mr. Braun and prosecutors were in negotiations over a cooperation deal, and this completely nuked that. Watch this report from MSNBC.
On his very last day in office at 12:51 a.m., ex-President Donald Trump pardoned a man named Jonathan Braun, who had been convicted of running a drug smuggling ring. Now, according to the new reporting from the New York Times, the consequences of this unusual pardon paint a broader picture of how Trump used the White House to influence the American justice system and how he could do it again in a second term. The Times writes, quote, "Just months after Mr. Trump freed him, Mr. Braun returned to working as a predatory lender, according to New York State's Attorney General. 2 months ago, a New York State judge barred him from working in the industry. Weeks later, a federal judge acting on a complaint from the Federal Trade Commission imposed a nationwide ban on him. A New York Times investigation drawing on documents and interviews with current and former officials and others familiar with Mr. Braun's case found that there were even greater ramifications stemming from the commutation than previously known.
That was a very clean breakdown, and I'll play a little bit more, but I just want to point out one of Donald Trump's strategies is to throw so much stuff at the wall to see what sticks that you begin to overwhelm your opponent. For example, Donald Trump has said so many fascistic things that you begin to forget some of the other things that he said. I mean, he said he's going to be a dictator on day one so many times that I completely forgot that before he ran, he said that anyone who burns an American flag should lose their citizenship. And then he said that recently, and it reminded me, and I was like, wow, I completely forgot that happened. And then I realized he said he wanted to terminate all rules and laws in the Constitution. And then I remembered the Brad Raffensperger phone call. I mean, there's just so much stuff. I haven't even mentioned him echoing the rhetoric of Hitler verbatim. He just does so much stuff that slimy acts like this. I'm not going to call it a crime just yet, but it is definitely an odd act that should be looked into. Stuff like this flies under the radar, and there are so many examples of this. There are so many examples of small Trump stories of him committing wild crimes, and they just fly under the radar. What about the dozens and dozens and dozens of times that he just didn't pay contractors when he lived in New York or when he lived in Florida? And these people have reported their stories. They've reported their stories to the police, but Donald Trump has so much money that it doesn't bother him. He has so much influence that it doesn't bother him. And he can just trap that person in so many legal fees that they'd end up losing more money than they would have gained in the first place. That is the big highlight from those stories. There's a story of somebody that worked on Mar-a-Lago. They worked for months and months and months, and then Trump didn't pay them, and when they went to sue, Trump said, I will take everything that you own. I can win this. I have way better lawyers. So Donald Trump does so many things that they fly under the radar, is my point. He has screwed over so many small businesses, so many well-meaning people, so many people just trying to make their lives better in America, and we forget because he's done so many other wild things while he was the president, and we shouldn't forget. I need to make a mega list of Donald Trump's crimes, everything he's done while in office. To wrap this story up, at multiple levels, up to the president, the justice system appeared to fail more than once to take full account of Mr. Braun's activities. That's wild. At multiple levels, up to the president of the United States. After pleading guilty to drug charges in 2011, Mr. Braun agreed to cooperate in a continuing investigation, allowing him to stay out of prison but under supervision for 9 years. That entire investigation was nuked because of Donald Trump. In working to secure his release, Mr. Braun's family used a connection to Charles Kushner, the father of Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law, and senior White House advisor to try to get the matter before Trump. Jared Kushner's White House office drafted the language used in the news release to announce commutations for Mr. Braun and others. So, I mean, the corruption runs incredibly deep. Donald Trump was being influenced by Jared Kushner, who was being influenced by his father, who had some vague connection to Braun's family. That is how connections and corruption works in politics. You literally just need one tangential connection, and that makes you so much more powerful, and they cashed in on it. They talked to Charles Kushner, who talked to Jared Kushner, and it's just wild to me that such a corrupt scheme could take place, and that this man could get out of jail and continue to commit crimes, and Donald Trump isn't blamed for it at all. But when immigrants come over and commit crimes at lower rates than natural-born citizens, somehow that all falls on President Biden. Somehow all of it falls on President Biden. Donald Trump could pardon a serial killer who then goes on to kill more, but MAGA would never fault Donald Trump for that. That is how it works. That is how MAGA plays the game. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like, make sure you comment a blue heart, hit that subscribe button. That's all I ask of you. But most importantly, have a great Sunday.